Welcome back, everybody. I am finishing up my workday with a very ill-advised 6 p.m. coffee. So if I'm never going to sleep again, we might as well make a video. I wanted to come and talk today about mental hunger, the term, not the thing itself, and why I don't use it and why I don't think that it's always helpful as a classification of hunger, or why any specific category or name that we give hunger is particularly helpful. Now, hunger comes up a lot in terms of client work, and it was also a personal part of my own recovery, was reacquainting myself with hunger cues, fullness cues, craving cues, satisfaction cues. It's a really big part of a lot of the client work that we do, because it makes sense that when we have had a disordered relationship with food, when we haven't been eating regularly or adequately, or our variety hasn't been great, it could be a combination of those things, it could be one of those things, the body signals start to get out of whack. And it's not actually us having to trust our body again, it's very often our body having to learn to trust us, because if it comes knocking every day and we consistently ignore its cue, it kind of gives up. And the way that we communicate with our body starts to get off kilter, right? So helping people reacquaint themselves and realign themselves with those physical sensations is really important, just from like a biological perspective. But then there's also the meaning that they're attaching to those feelings of hunger, which very often is more morally acceptable to eating disorder self, right? That fullness is morally less acceptable. That there's also like heightened emotions that come along with that it might be numbing for us to sit more in the hunger part of the sensation spectrum, and more distressing to experience cravings, to experience fullness. So it's not just, okay, we're going to wake these signals up and get them reconnected. It's also helping people to unpack the meaning they're attaching to those feelings, the language they're using, very often very morally charged language, very emotionally charged language. And I think that even though it can be quite recovery oriented, some of these words that we attach to hunger, even in a recovery sense, can bring some of that thinking over from eating disorder thinking into recovery thinking, right? And mental hunger is a very clear example of this to me, because 99% of the time when I'm talking to somebody who's experiencing mental hunger, which is thinking about food, planning food, hyperfixating on food, whether or not it's just food in general or a certain kind of food or a certain food item, just said the same thing twice as if that's the first time that's ever happened. They will use this term mental hunger and they will put it in this different category of like acceptability than any other kind of hunger. That to me is where it can become a problem, because it's starting to move into a territory of like, I can justify my hunger in recovery. I can justify eating certain things or at certain times or in certain ways if it comes with like this certain acceptable language or meaning or belief, right? Because I think that people think of mental hunger as like, I'm just thinking about food and I can stop myself from thinking about food. I'm thinking about this certain kind of food I want and I can just stop myself from thinking about food. And if I can't, that means that I'm weak or I'm out of control or I can't be trusted or whatever it might be, because I'm just so fixated on this and I can't stop thinking about it. And when I unpack this with clients, I really encourage them to steer away from classifications like mental hunger, extreme hunger. We validate those feelings and we validate, the distress that might come up or the guilt or the shame that we might need to process and, get to unpacking where all those beliefs and all of those feelings have come from. But long-term, try to move away from those labels, because we're taking what is a spectrum and putting it into categories and giving it, like I said, language that either works for us or works against us. And I really think this is one that works against us, because like I said, it's just a spectrum of hunger. And mental hunger is really just physical hunger. And here's how and why. So like I said, when people are talking about mental hunger, they're talking about thinking about food, planning food, their attention just suddenly being totally on food, not being able to get on with other tasks, maybe starting to become irritable. That's their brain saying, I need something to fuel myself, which makes complete sense because if you are eating enough, important caveat, if you are eating enough, your brain requires 20% of what you eat every day in order to function. It far and above takes the lion's share of what we eat. I'll pop a link below to a really fantastic article that I refer to a lot, which I think, very often it's the rational, practical, sciencey things that can really cut through some of our eating disorder beliefs about a lot of this stuff. And this is one that is really, really powerful because it's what I refer to as universal evidence. This is evidence that applies to majority of people by a landslide. If you have a body and a brain, this is going to be true for you, right? It makes complete sense that the brain is the first thing to sense that it needs more fuel and specific kinds of fuel. It's the first thing to start planning. It's the first thing to start focusing. It's the first thing to be running through, okay, lunch is coming up. Okay, what's in the fridge? What am I going to have? It's the first indicator in a long line of indicators on this spectrum of hunger signals that is completely logical and understandable and legitimate as some of the signals that your eating disorder is probably more likely to think are acceptable. Because when I'm talking to clients about hunger, one of my first questions is, well, how do you define hunger? What are indicators to you that you're hungry? And some of the indicators they describe are really far along on the fullness and hunger scale. Really great reference to this is in The 8 Keys to Recovery by Carolyn, where she lays out this really fantastic spectrum, like I was saying, right, of hunger and fullness. What your eating disorder does over time is it pushes you further and further along on this spectrum of hunger until it moves you into one of the more intense experiences of hunger and says, this is hunger. This is like the first sign of hunger. When actually, by that point, you're quite far into the distressed part of the hunger scale, right? Where you're probably also moving into irritability, where you're more like that hangry experience, right? Where literally somebody is going to lose their life if they get between you and a carbohydrate. That is where it gets you to live for so long that starts to feel like the acceptable range of hunger, whether or not that's emptiness in your stomach or it's like a physical sensation in your stomach. For some people, it might be that they start to feel anxious and they start to feel lightheaded. Again, these are really quite far along on the hunger scale. So the mental hunger, which is still physical hunger because your brain is an organ, and one would argue the most important one, it's the control room of everything. It's sending and receiving signals. It's regulating everything, right? It is absolutely at the epicenter of everything in your body. It makes sense that it is the first one to say, hi, I as a physical organ physically need fuel. So segmenting it into this mental hunger, I'm just thinking about food, I'm just fixated on food. It's also used in terms of, there's a certain food that I'm focusing on, there's a certain kind of food group that I'm really fixated on. That can very often just be the same thing, that there's a food group that your body, your brain, whatever, needs more access to. That there are days where you're going to eat more carbohydrates, where you're going to eat more protein, you're going to eat more fats, depending on what your body is using those different food groups for. It's no better or worse. You are not stronger or weaker for experiencing one or the other. More valid or less valid for experiencing one or the other. And moving away from those labels long term, I think, is an important part of the work. As I said, you've got to meet yourself where you are. Recovery is incremental. It means that you are going to need to take different approaches at different times, have different kind of maybe philosophies that you're applying or different modalities that are helpful for you. And maybe this language piece is important as well. But I think at some point being able to break away all the conditions and all the labels, it's kind of like, as much as I think that in some contexts diagnosis is really important, there are just even more contexts where it's not important. My team and I do not ask people for their diagnosis when they reach out to us. We do a full history intake where we get the blueprint of people's behaviors and their beliefs and their experiences and their current patterns with food and movement and body image and body monitoring. And that tells us way more than if somebody gives me a label like a diagnosis. Because again, all these behaviors and all these experiences are on a spectrum. Breaking out of that rigid thinking is so incredibly important, especially if that rigid thinking is being used to legitimize or delegitimize a reason to eat. That if we tell ourselves it's just mental hunger, or I can't respond to that because it's only mental hunger, we don't want to be holding on to that long term. Or I can respond to my extreme hunger because that's valid and legitimate. But if it turned into just like regular hunger, more sort of regulated levels of hunger, and that legitimate feeling goes away, or that legitimate label I've attached to that extreme hunger goes away, what do we then do with that? So I think just being conscious of that, being mindful of that, if that feels like it's a phase of your recovery where you're ready to maybe look at some of that stuff, I hope that maybe some of those reflections are helpful. But yeah, it's been something that's percolated for a long time, where I would hear the term and I'd be like, what is it about that just feels like it could be limiting, or it could be a bit rigid? And I was so benefited when I came across that. I think it's Scientific American, the article that I'll put in the link below. And I dove into all of that subject matter because I had absolutely no self-compassion when I went into recovery. I had an absolute like practical lens. And when I found out that 20% number, I was like, that makes sense to me. That makes complete sense to me. All of these physical experiences that I'd turned into this moral failing of mine, or like I said, like just a unacceptable reason to eat or to respond to what my body was telling me, because the brain, like I said, is a body part, which I learned at the age of 25. I'm kidding. But it sends us very, very helpful, valid hunger signals. So I think that it is an important thing to, at the right time, maybe have a think about. Lovely to see you all again. We will be back with another podcast episode next week about what to do if you've relapsed. That'll be fun. No, I'm kidding. It's always fun with Holly. And there is still, I think, a ticket left to the Recovery Essentials course coming up at the end of July. I am incredibly excited to get stuck into that 5-week course with all of our amazing attendees who are coming along. That link is in the description box below as well. It covers all of the key coaching stuff that I can teach people, all the really fundamental skills, tools, mindset shifts, even some of this stuff that we've talked about today. But we'll be back, like I said, next week with another episode and just some very exciting stuff coming up. I have been on an absolute mission with a couple of projects recently, and it's incredibly exciting. She's doing like 14-hour days, but I am very lucky. I do love what I do. But I am gonna not be having 6 o'clock coffees anymore. I'm gonna go and try to not stay up for 72 hours. Much love, take care. I'll see you guys soon.